Okay, so hello everybody, and welcome to our session here today with the clinical trainees from the Clinical Psychology Doctorate Training Programme. Jane and I are here from your Psychology Careers team, and we're delighted to have the trainees join us today to share their experiences and really tell us a little bit about the programme and their journey to get there. So we're going to share with them the common questions that we get asked from yourselves, and hopefully from today you'll get some more insight into your own journey if this is something that's of interest to you. So I'd like to just ask our trainees just very briefly to say hello and introduce themselves briefly to you all. So if I start with Bex.
Hi, my name's Bex. I'm a first year trainee at Manchester.
Great. Esmira.
Hi, I'm Esmira and I'm also a first year trainee at Manchester.
Thanks. Becky.
Yeah, Becky, and also a first year trainee at Manchester.
And Alyssa.
Hello, yeah, I'm Alyssa. I'm also a first year trainee at Manchester.
That's great. So I'll hand over to Jane and she will start the questions.
Okay, yeah, hi everybody. Perhaps if I could ask the first question to Bex. Could you tell us about the voluntary experience and the paid work experience that you gained prior to successfully getting selected onto the doctoral training programme?
I can. So kind of I'll go back to sort of my undergraduate days, because that's where sort of started for me. So when I was doing my undergraduate in the last year, I got an opportunity to do a sort of a placement with the uni and I ended up working as a support worker as part of the last year of my undergraduate. So and in that role I was working with people with learning disabilities, autism and other disabilities as well. So when I finished university I carried on in that role, working as a support worker, and I also kind of progressed a little bit within that company and started to work as an autism specialist mentor for young people at university that had autism and were struggling a little bit with the tasks of university and the emotional elements of that as well. So I worked as a support worker then for a few years, but in amongst that I also went away to Sri Lanka and I volunteered under the SLV project that you might have heard of, and it was a 6-week placement in Sri Lanka, volunteering as a mental health worker, and in that I volunteered in psychiatric hospitals and with children with learning disabilities and also teaching English. So that was really interesting and I loved doing that. It was 6 weeks long, and when I came back I continued to work as a support worker, and then I decided to do a master's, so I was doing a master's alongside that as well. When I was doing my master's I also volunteered at a project in Newcastle, which is where I did my undergraduate and my master's. And it was a project called the REVOC project, and it was building resilience for victims of crime. So we did some sort of emotional coaching on the phone and speaking to people who've been victims of crime. And we also ran a support group for people who've been victims of crime. And it was often the case that there was victims and perpetrators were much the same, in terms of there were people who were victims were also perpetrators. So it was a really interesting group and group dynamics. So that's what I did voluntarily until I finished my master's. After my master's I then applied to work as an assistant psychologist in quite a few different places, but it was really, really difficult to get a job in that, as it is, as we all know, it's quite tough. But I managed to get a job as an assistant at a residential school in Doncaster, where I worked part as an assistant psychologist and partly as a support worker. So that was really interesting experience. It was with children who had learning disabilities and autism. And I did that for about a year. And that was a really good it was a really good experience, and also a really good stepping stone into a full-time assistant post as well. So after about a year, I then moved to work in Calderdale in a CAMS service there. And I was there for about a year and a half, 2 years, before I then got onto the doctorate. So that's sort of my journey to the doctorate. But I did a lot of support work along the way, alongside my studies and sort of afterwards as well. And that really helped, I think, to get experience in the first place. And then I would definitely recommend any volunteering opportunities that you can do, anything relating to sort of anything to do with the emotional side of well-being. Anything around that is really valuable experience, and just really helps you to not only to get onto the doctorate, but also to just gain that experience yourself.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bex. That's a really good and clear kind of picture of your journey. Can I just ask, you mentioned your master's. What was your master's in?
It was in clinical and health psychology.
Okay, that's here at Manchester as well.
It is, but that was in Newcastle that I did that.
Okay. Did you say you did that part-time and worked or volunteered at the same time?
It was full-time, but with the masters, I sort of had the capacity to work as well.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's good. And just a final thing, you mentioned that you had a year and a half in the CAMS service. What were you doing there?
Well, I think that was probably where I got the most valuable experience, really. So I had my own caseload, so I was doing CBT with some young people. I was also part of the neurodevelopmental assessment team, so we did assess for ADHD, autism, and then I ran a DBT group as well. There was a few different bits that I was doing, but I think the therapy parts of it were really, really valuable. And also being part of the neurodevelopmental team really helped to get a bigger scope of different levels of difficulties that people have. And I think the experience that I'd had from being a support worker really helped when gaining that role, because I already had experience in autism and learning disabilities, so that really supported my application in that.
That's great. So just a quick question to our other graduates. You've had that's a fairly kind of, classic journey, if you like volunteering, the support worker, the assistant psychologist. Any of our other grads, anybody had something quite different in terms of their experience, or is there anything that you'd like to add in terms of your experience of volunteering? Open it up to the panel.
I just think, I guess I am really aware that I didn't do a master's, and I also didn't do an assistant psych post at all, which I think are quite classic when people normally put their application in. It's quite classic to see those things, and I feel that I don't feel like it was kind of missing from my application, because I did quite a lot of work in research, so I feel like that made up for the maybe not doing the master's experience. So I just wanted to add that, really, because I think it's important that you don't necessarily have to do those particular roles.
That's good. That's good. The next question actually might build upon what you've just said, actually, Becky, which is, was there any experience that you found particularly relevant and helpful to sort of getting you, noticed on the doctoral application form? So do you want to kick off with that one?
Yeah. So I did quite a lot of work in research, and I guess what's quite important with that is I got the opportunity to work with people that were based at the University of Manchester. So I got to work with Else Guthrie, who used to be at the university, on a project that was doing a CBT intervention in the community. And I also got to work with Adrian Wells, who was doing a metacognitive therapy intervention. So I think what I gained from that was obviously the opportunity to kind of work with people that are quite well known and also quite specialist in their subject area. And also just to see how how research can go into clinical practice, because I guess that's what's quite important in research. It's not just doing the research, but then learning how it's going to end up in clinical practice. So I feel like I gained a lot of skills with that as well, because I didn't have that master's. So I got the opportunity to contribute to papers and also to be involved in data analysis as well. So that built on my application form for the clinical doctorate. But the other experience I think that was really vital for me was that recognising that the majority of my experience was research, I went into a PWP role, so a psychological wellbeing practitioner, and worked within IAPT. And that really, for me, allowed me that opportunity to gain the clinical experience and some face-to-face contact with people as well. So I just think that, I think it's really important to think about what your personal application form looks like. And if you are missing any particular areas, to really think quite seriously about where you might be able to gain that. And it was quite risky for me to take that jump to a clinical role, but it obviously worked out.
That's great. And can I ask you, how did you get your research post? Was that through an advertised position or some kind of networking? How did that come about?
So I actually started the research position because, I guess similar to Bex, I did some volunteer work. So I volunteered on a research project for half a day, and that voluntary position eventually meant that when an opening came up for a full-time position, I was in a really good place to apply because I already knew the research, and yeah, I ended up getting a full-time position with that research project. And I think given that once you're on one research project, it's quite easy, I think, to move on to the next one, because you have a really good sense of what they're looking for, and a lot of the skills are really quite transferable as well. So that led me onto more research posts.
And the PWP role that you mentioned, did you apply for a trainee position?
Yes. So that was a trainee position that I took. I guess I recognised that most of my experience was research, and that maybe the only way to gain that clinical experience was either an assistant psychology post or to get the trainee position. And as Bex has already mentioned, those assistant psychology posts are just so far and few between, and there's so much competition for them. So when I got the opportunity to do the training, I kind of jumped at it, to be honest, especially because it's paid and it guarantees you to go forward into a paid role.
Yeah, absolutely. And you feel that PWP role has helped you in terms of settling into your first year of your doctoral training? You don't feel any disadvantage from not having done an assistant role?
No, I really don't. I really feel that, I guess everybody's experience is unique, but what I feel that was really useful about the PWP role is that because you get that opportunity to learn about assessment, to learn some experience of formulation and some intervention, so particularly around CBT, I feel like it gave me a really good grounding of, CBT itself, which not only has been useful for the beginning of the training course, but I'd also say that was a useful thing in my actual application form and also at the interview process, because I guess part of the interview process involves thinking clinically about a patient and thinking about risk issues. And because those were things that I was doing in my day-to-day role, I was able to think about experiences that I'd had and how I might be able to apply it to the interview question.
Oh, that's brilliant. And Alyssa and Esmira, I just wondered, is there anything that you kind of going to add in terms of a particular experience that you had that you felt really made the difference or helped you to stand out in your application to the doctoral programme?
Yeah, so my experience is quite similar to Becky in terms of it being more research heavy. Slightly different order to Becky's, in that I worked clinically for a few years as a support worker, doing some outreach work, and I also got an assistant post after many years of trying, but it was a very short-lived post because I ended up pursuing a PhD, just to, again, similar to what the girls have said, to try and open up my opportunities for different career paths, because clinical is very, very competitive, and so it was kind of important for me to kind of look elsewhere as well, a little bit. So I ended up pursuing a PhD, which I think, without a doubt, made a huge kind of impact in my kind of success on, at least on the Manchester course. I feel like they probably valued that experience quite a lot, particularly because it was a clinically relevant PhD. So I worked with individuals who were experiencing psychosis and were accessing kind of support from mental health services. So it was a very clinically relevant PhD. So that was, in my opinion, quite important experience, but I certainly wouldn't recommend that people do a PhD to get on a clinical doctorate, just because there's a huge commitment on so many different levels. I pursued it because I quite like research, and I kind of plan to pursue that kind of avenue even after I kind of qualify as a clinician. It's something I'm interested in sort of doing a bit of both. So for me, it felt like a natural step, but it certainly isn't something that I would recommend that people do as a way into clinical psychology, just because it's a lengthy commitment on time and also emotions.
I can imagine. So thank you for that. My final question in this section, really, if I can ask you, Alyssa, to start off with this, really your top tips for, you know, a really good application. You've all been successful, you've all got through it. You know, what kind of advice could you give our students in terms of making your application really stand out?
I think that one of the things, I would echo what the other guys have said about voluntary experience. I think if I think about everyone I know who's got a place on a course, so many people have started off doing some kind of like voluntary role at undergrad, and that has just like opened the way for so many different experiences. And that's, I won't bore you with my whole journey because it's very similar to the others, but that's the exact same thing that happened to me. Is like the voluntary experience really like opens doors to those like really competitive posts that are virtually impossible to get, especially I think as an outsider. So I don't know if that necessarily has a huge impact on your application form, but I'm sure it doesn't look, I think it's quite an important thing that everyone will have and that you should really make sure you've got. I think in terms of the application form, my main bit of advice would probably be is you've got 4 unis that you can apply to, and like be a little bit strategic about it, which I think it took me quite a few times to get on. And I think that if the thing that I learned was to be strategic about where I was picking, and the experience that I've got and the unis I was applying for, and definitely the first couple of times I didn't get that right. So like different unis will be looking for completely different things. So for example, like Manchester likes research and they don't mind if you haven't got loads of years of clinical experience. So the first year I didn't put down Manchester. Can you hear? Is it still okay? Yeah. And then, for example, I know, like, I think off the top of my head, Liverpool prefers people to have like 4 or 5 years. So it's really worth like talking to as many people as you can, thinking about the unis that you're applying to and the experience you've got. And yeah, just being a bit strategic. I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah.
The only bit I would add is something that made a huge impact on me. So I applied a few times as well. And the first few times when I applied, I tried to write my personal statement based on what I thought courses were looking for, and what I thought a clinical psychologist should look like, and what I think the course, it was so much more focused on what I thought others were looking for, not necessarily what was important to me. This last time when I applied, I kind of started back from scratch and thought, what is it that I'm passionate about? What is it that makes me ready for clinical training? But why is it that I want to do this job and why I want to be a trainee? And I think that made a huge difference in terms of potentially my success, and that I focused on the things I was most passionate about and what the experiences that I felt reflected who I was as a person, the kind of clinician I wanted to be at the end of the training. Obviously, there were kind of things I couldn't not talk about, so there's particular skills that we're expected to kind of be able to demonstrate, but I reflected on them in a way that was personally significant to me, rather than necessarily looking at what everybody might say. And this was just a tip that was shared with me at an open day, where they said that whenever applicants write the personal statements, they tend to look quite similar, because everybody writes what they think the courses are looking for, and not necessarily what's important and what makes them unique as an individual. And that can be quite scary, because you're not going with the mold and following what everybody else is doing. But I think that felt quite important to me.
I'd definitely echo that. Oh, sorry.
No, carry on, Beth.
I was just going to say that I definitely echo that kind of trying to fit a mold, and then eventually deciding that actually you just need to bring in whatever unique elements that you have. And we are all unique, because I guess it kind of highlights here that we've all had so many roles and so many journeys to get on the course. It's not really, unfortunately, it's not quite a short route to get onto clinical psychology. So most of us do have a lot to talk about, and it's more about trying to cram it into that very small section. But I guess one of the things that I would also say as a kind of top tip is, because we've had lots of jobs, what I would advise doing is really think about each of those jobs that you've had and that you're writing about, really try and make them sound as distinct as possible. So I guess even things that I remember doing, such as within my role, I went from like a research assistant to a senior research assistant, and I took the opportunity to divide those roles on my application form so that I could highlight exactly which skills I'd gained from each role. So just try and think a little bit creatively about how you can get as much information about yourself in that application form. And then the other thing I was going to say is think about your references. So obviously the people that are writing your references for you, hopefully you've got a good relationship with them, but try not to be too scared about having a conversation about what you would like them to kind of highlight are your attributes or experiences that you've had as well. Because most people are really open to that, and you providing an update of what you've been doing, I don't know, maybe since your university undergrad, for example. And it's just a good way of getting in some of the other criteria that they're hoping that you'll meet without having to put it in the application form itself.
Good. Yeah, Alyssa's got a point.
Add one thing, the references I was going to say, in terms of when you're thinking about your strategy, I think it's really worth, from really quite a young age or an early stage, thinking about the references that you're going to have. So I really didn't have an academic reference because I didn't do a master's. So that was something that I think delayed me by like a year. Whereas if I'd start thinking about that undergrad, I probably could have worked something out. So I think being really familiar with the application form from as early on as possible, like undergrad, will help.
I'd agree with that, definitely, because I ended up using my undergrad reference even though I'd actually qualified 10 years ago, so that made it quite difficult for that person to write my reference. But I guess what I did is I tried to maintain a relationship and provided a summary of other jobs and experiences that I'd had, so they had more to write about me.
I think as well, I was just gonna add as well that I think Manchester in particular put a lot of a lot of oomph on the reference, so it's quite important what is said in the reference. So yeah, working hard on that and working with the person that's going to write your reference is really important. And I would just as well say the same as what Mira and Becky were saying as well, about being honest on your application, because I think it is such a really difficult thing to write. But just trying not to make it into a list of things that you've done, because that's what they want to see is more about what you've taken from what you've done and what you've learned and how you feel about what it is that you've done. And I think on mine, I sort of got to a point of you sit and you go over it so much and you just don't know what you're going to put. But then in the end, I just sort of thought about what it is that I've actually really taken, and what it is that in the long journey that it takes to get onto the doctorate, what is it that's kept me going throughout and kept me wanting to do it. And there was parts of it that weren't necessarily or weren't glaringly obvious as a sort of application, but for me in my last role before the doctorate, it was the service development part of it was really, I found that really interesting, really important. So I really reflected on that and talked about how that was important to me and why it was, and why I wanted to pursue that part of it, and how I hoped that the doctorate would support me in that. And that you know, it seemed to fare quite well. But that honesty sort of came, I felt that when I read it, I read it back earlier before we did this, and sort of looking at it, I feel like I was being really honest, and it does, I feel like it comes across that way as well. So I think that is really important.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everybody for sharing those insights with us. I'm going to hand over to Amanda now for our next set of questions.
Yeah, I just want to drill down a little bit on some of the things that you've already talked about, and ask you a little bit more about that kind of research experience that you've had. So some of you have research roles, some of you have had postgrad qualifications. So my next question is really, how important you feel that research experience was in your application, and how valuable it is now for you now you're on the programme. So if I can come to Bex first and just tell me a little bit about how you think for you it was a master's, how that played a role in your application so far.
Yeah, so I suppose when I did my master's, it was never sort of something that I was passionate about doing, should I say, in terms of my path to doctorate. But I think I applied for some assistant roles, and I was finding it increasingly difficult. And that's when I decided that was going to be the best step, is to get that research element in for the doctorate. So I think the most important bit for me was when I was doing my master's, I did a research apprenticeship with one of the lecturers at the university. And I knew that he was really interested and had written a book on low intensity CBT. And I knew that was something that I wanted, that was important in getting skills around that. So I did a research apprenticeship with him. And in terms of my experience, that I've had my undergraduate and my master's and the research apprenticeship whilst I was doing my master's, but that is the only sort of research elements that I had on my application. So I think that piece of apprenticeship that I did was probably really important in ticking that sort of research box for me, because the rest of my work was more clinical. So I think that was quite important. But also in the services that I'd worked in, I did service evaluations while I was there, and I think that's quite important in terms of research, or it can be if you don't have as much research experience, then considering service evaluations and audits. And when I was writing the application, I sort of put that in the research box. I sort of talked about the fact that I'd done service evaluations. So I wouldn't be scared if you haven't got much research background. Like, I didn't have that much at all. But because I think as long as you reflect on it, and as long as you really think about what you have learned from what you have done, I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you. Could you just say a little bit about that research apprenticeship? Is that something that's kind of informal, or something that's kind of advertised while you were on the programme?
I think so. On the master's course, it was an option as one of the credits was to do a research apprenticeship. But you sort of had to organise it yourself. So I sought somebody out at the uni who I knew was involved in CBT, and he'd actually been the previous admissions officer for the doctorate. So I don't know whether that was maybe a little bit sneaky, but he wasn't anymore. But but he was good. He still was good and helpful for that. So yeah, that was just with him really, and I sort of asked him what he needed help with, and if he needed any help, and he was rewriting his book at the time, and he needed a bit of support with chapter 2. So that's where I came in and did some sort of, I did a systematic review on some of the research around CBT and mobile devices and computerized CBT. So that was really, really helpful. And actually working, doing the doctorate now, when we're looking at doing literature reviews ourselves, I've taken a lot of knowledge from that, and it's really supporting some of the stuff that we're doing now.
That's great, thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on how their research experience has helped them, whether it's through formal postgrad qualifications or otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would echo what Bex was saying about how it's really useful now. I think what working in a research role helped me with, in terms of my application, it helped me with publications, because I had publications that I could put onto my application. But I also feel like it helped me in terms of answering some of the questions at the interview stage around research, just because it meant that I felt more confident about the research element. But then when it comes to the course now, I feel like it teaches you to think critically. I think working in research projects, you're thinking critically about things all the time. You're at meetings where people are thinking critically about things, and that's really helped with thinking about research now, and also thinking about the methodology aspect when it comes to my research project. It just means that I've got more confidence, and I don't feel as scared about the research element of the course.
Great. What about the assistant psychologist role? I know a lot of people aspire to it. I think a lot of you already talked about kind of like trying to get those assistant psychologist positions. If you don't get a formal assistant psychologist role, did any of you feel that that was a disadvantage in any way? Or, you know, then like to just to comment on, from other trainees on the course that you've seen as well, how kind of important you think it is to get that formal position? So can I start with this, Mira?
Yeah, so like I said, I left my assistant post fairly quickly, and although I included it in the application, because I just, in my mind, I thought it would look good to be able to say I was able to attain an assistant post, even though I didn't kind of retain it for very long. I think they are important. I think perhaps they are become potentially less important over time, and that courses are really valuing a wide variety of experiences, not just, you know, maybe 10 years ago when I finished my undergraduate, my first thought was you have to get an assistant post, because if you don't get that, then clinical is not going to happen for you. I think although now they are still quite important, I think courses do value a range of different experiences, so support worker roles, PWP posts, healthcare assistants, lots of voluntary positions. So I did loads of voluntary positions that I think kind of supported my application a little bit. So it is kind of thought of the gold standard experience, but if you don't have it, I know of plenty of people who are currently training that haven't actually had any assistance posts. So I don't think it's the thing that you have to have, just because they are really, really competitive to begin with anyway. And I wouldn't say that there are many around. In the years that I looked, for about 3 years while I was working kind of as a support worker, not many came up in the Northwest. So I was having to look beyond that, and you have to consider those kind of factors as well in terms of whether you are able to relocate to a different part, and think about the financial costs associated with that. So I think, yeah, they are important, but you can get on the training program without it. There's other experiences that are valued, I think, quite equally. You just have to look at what each university has kind of, Lisa says, just look at what each university values and what they look for. There is I forget what it's called. It's like a handbook that's released every year, and that gives you a rough idea of what kind of experiences trainees have had at different courses, so that can kind of give you some ideas about what jobs to look for, but also what each course values.
It's really useful. Did anybody else want to comment on that question before we move on? No?
I just wanted to say that obviously I didn't have one, but I think that with an assistant psych role, it's good for a course because obviously it's really clear that somebody's had that experience of working with a psychologist and maybe had that clinical experience that Mira was talking about. But I think if you can find other positions where you maybe still get some of those experiences, but it doesn't necessarily have the title of an assistant psych role, then you're winning really, because that's what they're looking for, is that actual experience.
I think we've also heard people comment about it's good to be in a role where you can be supervised or working with a practicing psychologist. So I guess that probably is a similar thing there.
That's what I'm thinking about, whereas I feel I got that from my research position, and therefore it wasn't as relevant for myself.
Yeah, I'd sorry, just to add to that, I'd say supervision by a clinical psychologist when it comes to you applying, I think is quite key, because the reference essentially asks about your suitability to be a trainee, to be a clinician. And I don't think there are many other professionals who'd be able to comment as accurately about your suitability for that as a trainee. So that's one thing that I was told throughout kind of my journey, is that your reference should be by a clinical psychologist, really. And in the past, when it hasn't been, I wasn't successful. So I don't know whether there was an association there, but that was at least my experience.
Great. Thank you. And the last question from me for this section is, we've talked about the experiences that have been important to you, but can you say a little bit about any individuals or particular people that you found have been really useful or pivotal in you on this journey to being a clinical psychologist trainee? So I'll start with Alyssa, if that's okay.
Yeah. I'd say the most useful person I had in terms of getting a place. Am I going correctly? No.
It's fine. You're good. You're good then.
Was the supervisor I had who works on the Manchester course, which I got in a research role. So obviously that's not going to be key for anyone, but I guess if you're being supervised by someone who's working on one of the programs, they can give you quite a lot of knowledge about what the course might be looking for. They can help you to get the kind of experiences that the program might be looking for. They can give you a bit of information about the interview and what it's like to be, what it's likely to be, just those kind of things. Obviously that's not going to be essential, but I do think that if you get a really good supervisor who is really willing to like support you and who's really kind of invested in you getting a place, that does have really big impacts. And I think that that's probably the same for other people as well. Whereas before I was in a PWP role and it was like brilliant, I was getting great experience, but I didn't really have a supervisor who really knew anything about the actual doctorate application process, which I think was one of the things. So then I moved to kind of like a research assistant post, and I think that that was something that I really gained, was just the supervision and the support in the actual application. Yeah.
Great, that sounds really useful. Anybody else like to comment?
Just the same. I feel my experience is exactly the same as Alyssa's. It's people, I was lucky enough to meet people that were on the involved in the course already.
I think for mine, I had a supervisor. Again, he was a clinical psychologist, but he was really passionate and really sort of invested in not only psychology but the social issues and everything that surrounds that in psychology, and that really opened up a lot of doors for me in terms of personal like investigation of all these different issues that really helped me when in the interview and applying for the course, and just kind of building my knowledge of clinical psychology in general as well. Again, I suppose that was sort of luck of the draw, but if you can get supervision from a psychologist, I suppose that's where it really does come in so well, because that he'd been qualified for only a few years, but so he was quite familiar with the process as well. But his passion really kind of was instilled in me then as well. So I think that, yeah, getting a psychologist or having some sort of relationship with a psychologist where they can advise you was really, really helpful.
Thank you. So I'll pass over to Jane for another couple of questions.
Okay, you're doing really well, guys. Stick with us. I'm going to open this up to the floor really now, because every one of you will have had this experience. So we want to know what your experience was. And that's of the interview itself, the doctoral training. So can you remember the kind of things they got you to do, or the questions that you were asked? Anybody want to leap in there with some Paul? Blanked it.
So yes, the Manchester interview is 30 minutes, which I'd say is very unusual. I've only ever I've interviewed at one other university, which was like a full day, a completely different experience. I thought the Manchester one was pretty good. You're in, you're out, and it's quite stress-free. Yeah, well, I interviewed at Essex, which is like near London, and it was like a full day. It was like a group task, which I think is quite familiar with some of the others. Then it was a test that you had to do, and then an interview. And I found it really hard, to be honest, and I didn't get off the place. So I think, yeah, but I guess, yeah, I wouldn't be put off by the types of interviews that places do when you're applying. I'd more look what's a fit for your experience. But I do think that if you've got an interview somewhere, being able to speak to someone who's interviewed there before is really, really helpful, because they can give you a heads up on what to expect.
Definitely. I only interviewed at one other place. I interviewed at Stafford. And again, that was kind of like a half day, but it involved 2 interviews and also a role play with a reflection task. And I just found it all a bit overwhelming, because there was sort of a lot of waiting and for the next task, or like, I guess, a lot of time to ruminate and think about what you'd said or what was coming up as well. Whereas what was quite nice about the Manchester one, I guess, like Alyssa said, is that you went in, you did your interview, and then you were out and it was done. And the rumination only happened when you got home. So yeah, I think that was a lot, for me personally, that was a lot nicer. But I guess it is worth bearing in mind that almost every place has their own way of interviewing and has a different thing that maybe they're looking for. So I guess that kind of falls into the same criteria of, when you think about where you're going to apply for and where suits you, the likelihood is that when you come to interview, they're going to be looking for something quite similar in the interview process. Whereas at Stafford, I didn't get offered a place there either, so I obviously didn't. That was wasn't my place to go to. It didn't suit me.
I think as well, something that you have to consider as well is that some places do the preliminary tests before the interview as well. And I know Manchester are introducing them from this year. We were quite lucky we didn't have to do that. But I'm afraid anyone else will, I think. But I did a preliminary test at University of East London before an interview as well. And I wouldn't be put off by it as such, but if you're someone that knows that you really struggle with that kind of examination, then that's something to consider when you're picking your universities as well. Yeah, in comparison, because I interviewed at one other place, which was University of East London, and comparably, I do think that Manchester was better. It's half an hour, so it is sort of very quick, and you've got to think on your feet, but it's very containing, and I think you can. There's room for subjectivity, so it's your interpretation of what's going on, and sort of remembering to think of not only with the vignettes, especially not only thinking about that individual, but also systemic and contextual factors as well. And that in general for the interviews, anywhere really, I think they've taken into account a lot of the societal factors. And in UEL, they were very heavily focused on social factors and a lot of things like the social graces, and just thinking about things like that. John Burnham, I think it is, if you wouldn't know what that is, but it's a good thing to think about, basically all the different elements that go into a certain person, and considering that for any interview, I think it's really important, because they are looking for that
I was just going to say as well, I think a lot, or at least the 2 interviews I went to, it did feel very much that they want you to do well, and that they're really looking at your thinking process within the interview. So even though I didn't kind of enjoy the Staffordshire one as much, because it was a lot more of reflection, they still seem to be very much looking for how are you managing within the interview, and what is your think. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking process of how you got to that kind of answer?
Good, thank you. Can I just ask you, the preliminary tests that a couple of you have mentioned, what are they testing?
I think that they do verbal reasoning skills. That's one of them. They tend to test. With the testing in UEL, it was they gave scenarios, and you had to rank the different answers from 1 to 5 as to which was the best option. So I think the example one was sort of around somebody who'd run into the road, and what's the best option. You have to rank what you would do in terms of shout, call the police, do things like that, in terms of immediacy. And obviously with the actual scenarios, it was more clinically based, so it could be all sorts of situations where a clinical psychologist might be, so in a forensic setting or a hospital, or with work colleagues, and they want to know how you sort of, again, like Becky says, how you process things, how you think about things. So that was my experience of it.
So more situational judgment tests rather than perhaps verbal or mental ability tests, more.
Yeah, I think it was a bit of both, to be honest. So there was the situational judgment, and then there was the verbal reasoning, and I think there was maybe a research element to it as well, and where it was more statistics based. In fact, actually thinking back, it was a statistics test where you had to sort of determine which statistical analysis you'd use and which type of number it was and things like that. So it was quite intense research-wise.
Okay, that's great. And was it you, Alyssa? You mentioned a group task as well, or was it at Essex? What was that about?
There was like 8 of you in a group, and gosh, you're testing me now. And there was a service user talking about their experiences of services, and then they put out questions to the group that we had to discuss as a group, and there was like psychologists from the kind of area sat all around the room like marking you, and I did find it really quite hard, to be honest. It's one of those things where like everyone's diving in to say things, and yeah, it was quite, but I mean, don't be put off. I think everyone finds group tasks absolutely horrendous, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. I won't test your memory anymore. We're going to bring you right up to date now and ask you about your first year experience. So what's it actually like on the doctoral training course? Again, I'll just open it up to anybody who wants to jump in first. What are you doing on your course? Go on, Bex, you can start.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely fantastic. So we've done our adult placement. We did that sort of September till March, I think it was, and we did 4 weeks of teaching, and we learned loads about CBT, but also so much more than that as well. We learned, it was 4 weeks of solid teaching, 9 till 5 every day. So there was loads of different bits that we learned that prepared us to sort of then go out into the placement. And we all got placed in different adult settings, and you can sort of put a preference down for that. So I was in a CMHT, which is a community mental health team for adults. So I was there until March, and then that finished. So that was a really good experience. Really enjoyed that. And then now we've been placed in child. Obviously with coronavirus and everything that's gone on, it's not been as easy as we'd have liked, but again, the course have been really good at trying to get the teaching sorted out. We've done it over Zoom, so we've had another few weeks of Zoom, and then we've been on child placement, so that's been fantastic as well. I personally love child placement and everything to do with working with children. So I found that amazing.
That's great.
And just to add to that, we're now starting to do our research projects as well. So kind of alongside that, from around, I think it was December time, they provided us with a kind of booklet of available research projects, kind of, I guess, interests of different supervisors, and just kind of rough outline of what might be available for us to do. And then we all found out what project that we'd been kind of allocated. It was essentially putting down your preferences, and then we're allocated at the beginning of the year. And now we're all in the process of, we've designed our projects, and we're getting those approved kind of by the university to say that they're feasible for us to actually carry out. So that's starting to run alongside our placements as well as our teaching.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to Amanda now. I think we're nearly at the end of our questions.
Yes, we've just got one last question for you, and that was really just to say, any final tips? So for the students that regularly are trying to find out more about clinical psychology and getting onto the doctoral program, would you have any last piece of advice or final tips for them? So where to go? I'll go to Alyssa, if that's okay.
Yeah, we've said it already, it's nothing new, but I would just say volunteer from really early on. And I guess thinking about it, like if you can't get an assistant post where you're being supervised by a clinical psychologist, volunteering is somewhere where you could get supervised by a clinical psychologist, especially if you're offering like voluntary work. So you could get that, and it will definitely open up experiences to you. I don't know anyone who hasn't had opportunities opened up from volunteering. And yeah, just think really carefully about where you're going to apply to and what experience you've got, and take the time to like chat to loads of people about it and get as much advice as possible.
I think it sounds really corny, but kind of enjoy the process as well. So try, I guess, like Mira was saying, that she decided to do a PhD because actually that's an area of interest rather than just doing it to get on the course. Try and pick roles and jobs or volunteer experiences where you do really think you'll enjoy them and you will gain something from them, so that you're kind of enjoying the process as you go along rather than just doing it to get on the course itself. And I think that way so many more things will open up to you.
I think for me that the main tip is, although obviously at the moment we're talking about experiences and everything beyond the course, but the core to successful clinical psychology application is a good undergraduate degree. So yes, do focus on getting clinical experience during kind of your degree if you can, but not at the cost of getting a good degree classification. So and I know that there are a lot of the universities that require minimum high 2-1, for example, and I think and that's not the case for every university. You know, and if you end up with a 2-2 or lower, there are lots of other things that you can do, but I think a good degree will make the process much easier and will open so many more doors in terms of where you can apply, because I have friends who got a variety of different kind of degrees, and even though they've got lots of experience, unfortunately sometimes courses do look at what classification you got for your degree, because it's just one way of reducing the number of applications that they get. So yes, do get experience, but not at the cost of getting a good degree first, and then think of building it. It is a long process for some. It's not always the case for everybody, but it certainly was for me. And I would definitely echo what Becky said, enjoy the experience, because the first few years of my training, my first few years prior to training, I don't think I was just too focused on making sure I get this, I get that. And my whole kind of life became consumed about getting on clinical training program, and it just wasn't a healthy place to be. So I'd say enjoy every experience that you have along the way, and don't focus too much on I must get this, I must get that, I have to compete with all these people. Focus on your own kind of journey to the course.
And one last piece, Bex?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd just say the same as what these guys have said as well, really. But as well, like the process to get on the course, it can be long, and you've got to sort of enjoy life, like you guys have said, and just make sure that it doesn't get in the way of your life, because it can be a long process, and you don't want to end up giving up other elements of life, because it is your career, but that is just one part of your life. And I think that I know a lot of people that have sort of reported that it has got in the way a bit, and it's just become quite difficult, and you do have to make certain decisions about where you're going to be and what you're going to do, but just to try and get that balance right with it as well. I think it is worth doing, 100%, no doubt, and getting on this course, the amount of stuff that we've learned already and everything that we've done is unbelievable. So it's worth sticking it out, but it doesn't have to be something that's done sort of right now. And if you need to wait a bit of time because you've got other things going on in your life, you know, that's okay. And there's people on our course that are doing it and they've got children, there's people that haven't, and it's just whatever's right for you at your point in life. I think that's important.
Our cohort is so varied in terms of our ages, in terms of our backgrounds and journeys, and in terms of, like you were saying, people who've got kids and who haven't. So it won't necessarily stop you getting on.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing all your insights, being honest, being really open. We really appreciate it. And we hope everyone watching has found it useful as well. So thank you very much. It's been really great to hear from you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.